Victor Petrosson, Archibald Weathers, Bek Storm, Phoenix, Harabec. All names and personalities assumed by perhaps the greatest immortal warrior mind in human history, with a legacy that would even outshine his father's, Emperor Solomon Petrosson I of the Great Human Empire. The Harabec Weathers we know by the Starsiege era is not actually the original Harabec. That person died in an accident at the age of 9 and pronounced to be brain dead by his doctors. However, that last fact was keenly omitted from public knowledge, and instead the boy's original mind was replaced with that of Victor Petrosson, the Emperor's equally immortal son. Before we continue with the history of Harabec Weathers, we must first explore how immortality works in the Starsiege universe, as it is quite unique from other fictional properties. Instead of having the body live forever, the brain of the person in question is transferred into an organomech machine that has been designed to follow the same shape and size of a typical human brain. This organomech brain consisted of incredibly complex solid-state neural nets that were powered by superconductor batteries in order to store the neural patterns of the immortal in question. Once the physical body either died or became too infirm to be useful, the brain would be transferred out of the old and into a healthier, younger body. This process would begin again once the new body outlived its usefulness, but there was a hidden cost that did not reveal itself to the new immortals until much later, when one of their own murdered 8 women for no discernible purpose. It was discovered that something in how the organomech brain interacted with the new body would cause changes in the immortal's personality, with the worst results ending with madness. Defining this condition as cell memory drift, the other immortals over time would be able to minimize CMD, but it would always remain a variable in their long lives. Fear of CMD was part of the reason why Emperor Petrosson stayed in his original body for over 400 years. On the opposite end was his son, Victor Petrosson, who had regularly undergone the brain transfer process multiple times, since the 25th century up until 2801. As a result, by the time Victor became Harabec, he was no longer the person he was over 400 years ago, due in large part to CMD. Whereas Victor, and his persona after, Archibald Weathers, was loyal to their father, by the time he had become Harabec, Victor had become openly skeptical of the Emperor and continually looked to trivialize and undermine the authority of the Empire. By 2801, Duke Lansing's Weathers' son, Harabec, was gravely injured in an accident. While the boy was brain dead, he was the ideal candidate to host Victor Petrosson's mind. When the boy eventually woke up again, it was Victor, not Harabec, who inhabited his body. The family that Victor Petrosson was implanted into were the Weathers, a proud line of warriors dating back to the dark days of the Fire, and had since given the Empire some of the finest knights to have ever served, including, at the time, future Imperial Knight Grandmaster Kanan Weathers, the original Harabec's brother. In this familial tradition, Bek was trained from an early age to ascend to the ranks of Imperial Knighthood, a trifling task for the boy, as the immortal mind within had over 300 years of experience behind him, all in various roles as a warrior. So when given a chance to display his aptitude for tactics and piloting, he was quickly recognized as a talented prodigy in the field of warfare. Due to his unparalleled mastery of the core skills needed to join the Empire's finest, Harabec was able to take the oath of knighthood at the age of 20, which was an unheard of achievement that beat out the previous record of 26 years old, held by his brother Kanan. Throughout Harabec's service with the Imperial Knights, he ascended to the rank of Knight Captain, due in large part to his penchant for distinguishing himself in combat operations, even going so far as to survive 2 separate missions where the expected outcome was utter defeat, and the loss of all Imperial forces involved. This seemingly unexplainable ability of his to defy the odds eventually landed him the call sign of Phoenix, as he always emerged from the flames, time and time again. But outside of combat, Harabec showed a blatant disregard for Imperial protocol, and frequently disputed his orders. In Bek's civilian life, his rebellious nature often led him into the wilder aspects of Imperial society. These unorthodox tendencies of Harabec troubled his family, as any actions on his part that could be seen as disgraceful would in turn stain the honor of the Weathers' name. This would often lead him to arguing with his closest loved ones in the family about his attitude and actions. especially Canaan. However, everything was to change for Harabec in 2819, during a disastrous night operation that would come to be known as the Turkhazakistan Debacle. While the full details of this operation have not been disclosed, what is known is that anti-imperialists in Turkhazakistan had staged a revolt against the Empire. Such brushfire rebellions on Earth were a common occurrence that were easily put down by either the TDF or the Imperial Knights. As such, the revolt in Turkhazakistan was initially not taken very seriously by either the media or the TDF. In this case, Harabec was given command of a night strike force to put down this revolt. However, at some point during the operation, the rebels had ambushed the Knights using state-of-the-art anti-cybrid weaponry. It was only due to the instincts and quick thinking by Harabec gained over his lifetimes of experience did he and a small handful of his Knights manage to escape with their lives. This event was a black mark on the Knights, who had just been handed their first ever defeat. Almost overnight, the media blamed this disaster on the weather's hotshot, and public opinion against Harabec turned outright hostile. Arguments between himself and Canaan intensified to the point where even Emperor Petrison himself had to intervene. Or at least that was the reason given to the public. Emperor Petrison called upon his once former son in a private meeting to discuss the brewing rebellion on Mars. Petrison wanted Harabec to go to the colony and join the rebels there so that they could be brought out into the open and crushed mercilessly. Bek's recent status as a disgraced knight would help lead credence to his cover story, and eventual disappearance from the public eye. Harabec, at least on the surface, agreed. But deep down, Bek vowed to himself that he would turn the Martian rebels into a real fighting force that could challenge the tyranny of the Empire and its military. Of course, the Emperor was no fool, and there was no one better in the universe who could understand Harabec's thinking better than his original father, regardless of the long years and the effects of cell memory drift. Petrison fully counted on Harabec to join the rebels in earnest and turn them into effective fighters. Why? Because Prometheus was still out there in the cold of space, and when it would return, Mars could be used as a means to potentially blunt Prometheus's renewed invasion. After a public show of increased hostilities to those around him, Harabec announced that he would take an extended leave of absence from his duties to let things cool off. Soon after, the man that was Harabec Weathers vanished. Not even his own brother Canaan knew what had happened to him. Later in the year 2820, Bek Storm began his new life on Mars. He drifted mainly, working the hard jobs common to the Duster's life, never once complaining. His charismatic charm easily won him friends and helped to assuage any ill feelings directed towards him due to his Terran heritage. But what Bek didn't count on in his travels was his growing love for the Martian people. Whatever remained of his loyalty to the Empire was inevitably crushed as he began to witness the oppressive actions of the Imperial Police. This led to him joining a cell in the Free Martian Alliance in 2824, after a rigorous set of tests to determine his true loyalty. Bek Storm quickly proved himself invaluable to the fledgling Martian resistance. His quick thinking, knowledge of Imperial methods, and leadership abilities were unparalleled. His rise to the ranks of the FMA reflected his own rise with the Knights, and Bek soon found himself as a lieutenant. He was then put in charge of researching and testing of the Tharsis weaponry, which was followed by a promotion to colonel. In his newfound role, he proposed that the cache technology should be used with rebel spacecraft to harass Imperial shipping from off-world. This way, the rebels could safely shake down the new gear and gather the necessary supplies to ignite their planet-wide revolt. The results of Bek's work with the Tharsis cache and their integration into rebel operations worked shockingly well, and before the end of 2826, cache technology had begun to be used by the rebel ground forces. By the next year of 2827, unrest had increased tenfold, and Mole Command, the leadership of the Martian Rebellion, realized the time to fully take the fight to the Imperials was upon them. But they needed a man in their inner circle that had the leadership and expertise to counter the TDF officer corps. There was only one viable option, of course, and Bek would see himself promoted to general, along with a seat at Mole Command. With the last piece in place, the rebels launched the Yoke Offensive at the beginning of 2828. At first it started with small-scale raids on border outposts and supply depots, inevitably working their way up to fully attacking Imperial police convoys and bases. But it wasn't until Bek led an attack on an Imperial communications platform did the Yoke Offensive truly go into high gear. In that operation, Bek's crew captured the platform, where he then proceeded to broadcast a message across the entirety of the solar system, that he was actually former disgraced Imperial Knight Harabec Weathers. After a brief statement of his intentions, he ended his declaration with a call to freedom to all the colonial worlds in the solar system, to throw off their Imperial oppressors. The effects of Harabec's revelation was felt almost immediately. The weight of having an Imperial Knight siding with the Colonials was utterly incomprehensible to the entirety of Imperial society. His brother Kanan made an oath of vengeance, whereas his father disowned him outright. On the other colonial worlds, such as Venus and the Jovian colonies, the populations began to rise up and challenge Imperial rule. Harabec's Phoenix Declaration had proved to be an unqualified success. Emperor Peterson, however, was secretly fuming at suddenly facing a system-wide revolution against his rule. While political unrest on Earth delayed his response, Peterson did eventually send a strike force of Imperial Knights dubbed Red Whirlwind to put down the Martian rebels, led by none other than the Grand Master of the Knights himself, Kanan Weathers. Back on Mars, the rebels were stunned. Harabec had managed to pass every test about his loyalty to the cause, but still managed to hide his history as an Imperial Knight. As being in the Knighthood was no simple feat that anyone could achieve, new concerns arose as to Bek's loyalty, and he was pulled from active duty, pending an investigation. However, questions to his loyalty to the Martian Rebellion would soon be quashed after the Imperial Security Chief of Mars attempted to have Harabec assassinated. He failed, obviously, otherwise this would be a much shorter video. But the fact that the Imperials tried to kill him was enough to clear him of the newfound doubts Mole Command had about him. But many of the dusters under Harabec were still wary of the ex-knight among them, so Bek was forced to leave the field work to a trusted lieutenant, and focus his efforts on the development of rebel stratagems. It was just as well anyway. Since the Phoenix Declaration, the rebels were closing in on the last Imperial police stronghold of Carter Flats, and after a prolonged siege, the Imperial headquarters fell. Through the taking of Carter Flats, Mars had become the first independent human state in the solar system, not under Imperial control. This was truly a historic occasion, but Harabec warned Mole Command to keep the celebration short. Red Whirlwind was due to arrive in a month's time, and preparations needed to be made for the fight of their lives. When news reached Peterson of Mars's liberation, he was outraged. The security of the Empire against the next hybrid invasion could not tolerate another actor on the political stage. In his anger, he unleashed the Imperial Grand Fleet who would follow behind the Red Whirlwind Task Force. When both groups would be united over Mars, the rebellion would be crushed in an overwhelming display of power as an example to the other colonies. And as predicted, roughly a month after the final battle for Carter Flats, Red Whirlwind ships had taken up orbit over Mars and began dropping the Imperial Knights, with the first wave led by the Knight Grand Master himself, Kanan Weathers. Kanan, in addition to his burning desire to restore the family honor, knew that Harabec would plot something during the first landings of his knights, and he fully intended to meet whatever his little brother had in store for him. He was correct. Harabec, along with an elite cadre of his own rebels, were cloaked, not too far away from the night landing zone. Harabec intended to use the temporary disorientation and grogginess from the landings to give his rebels the edge in the coming battle. And his plan may have worked too, if Kanan wasn't there. When the dust from the landing settled and the battle began, the two forces fought each other to a draw, with the knights taking heavy casualties, but Harabec's rebels being forced into a retreat. Harabec would continue to lead the Martian rebels using cunning stratagems and dogged perseverance, and for a while the rebels actually managed to hold off the knights. But when the Imperial Grand Fleet entered Martian space, the pendulum of war swung decisively in the Imperials' favor, and the rebels began losing ground quickly. But as Kanan and the knights began approaching Mole Deep, the headquarters for the Martian Rebellion, the knights began to receive orders to withdraw. Caught off guard by the unexpected change in the mission, the Imperials were thrown into chaos as everyone scrambled to reach hastily made evacuation zones on extremely tight schedules. Never one to stare a gift horse in the mouth, Harabec cobbled together a crew to take advantage of the sudden disorganization of the Knights and go for the top-level prize, the capture of Kanan Weathers. The mission proved to be easier than expected. As the last dropship left the planet, Kanan and his remaining knights found themselves surrounded by angry rebels. When Harabec came to meet his brother face to face, he simply offered his terms: surrender or be destroyed. Perhaps under normal circumstances, Kanan would have flatly refused Harabec's offer and go out with guns blazing to satisfy his honor. But there was obviously more going on than either brother realized. At the moment, he needed to stay alive long enough to find out what that was. So Kanan ordered the surrender of himself and his men. The Phoenix had officially defeated the Ice Hawk. But there was little cause for celebration. Once Kanan was taken into custody, Harabec immediately went to confer with his brother, and together they deduced the reason for the fleet's withdrawal. The Cybrids had returned. In the face of what was to come, Harabec then proposed something that would have been utterly unthinkable only a few days past: an alliance between the Martian rebels and the Imperials. Kanan readily accepted, and thus the human alliance was formed. At this point, the brothers would split up. Kanan and a selection of Alliance forces would travel to Venus to evacuate the colonists and TDF survivors there, while Harabec would travel to Titan and take charge of what was seen at the time to be the last chance of survival for the human race, Dies Irae. This massive endeavor took months to finish, and by the time Kanan returned to Titan with the Venusian survivors, Prometheus had already become wise to what the humans were doing. As the Dies Irae contingent was ready to embark, Prometheus launched a massive offensive against the launch site, but Harabec and Kanan both were determined to ensure the contingent's safety. Greatly outnumbered, outpowered, Harabec and Kanan valiantly led the Alliance warriors into combat against the Cybrid warforms. In the end, the Alliance defenders struck so hard against the Cybrids that their entire command hierarchy was in chaos, allowing for the Dies Irae ships to escape and hopefully begin life anew. With the future of their race secured, all that was left for the warriors of the Human Alliance was to dig in and fight to the last man and woman against the approaching Cybrid Knight. But amidst this dire picture, a small glimmer of hope was carried inside of a battered message pod as it entered Titan's atmosphere, which carried the findings from a long patrol vessel that Prometheus was on Pluto. Quickly conferring with his brother, Harabec and Kanan drafted a plan that would be humanity's last Hail Mary to avert the end of their species. The first stage of this plan was to use a captured Cybrid dropship to infiltrate a much larger Cybrid capital ship nearby in Titan space. From there, they would outfit their new prize with the means to support both human crew and war materiel. When the refits were complete, the next stage would be relatively straightforward: infiltrate Pluto and kill Prometheus. Codenamed Operation Cardinal Spear, Harabec, Kanan, and a selection of the Alliance's most elite warriors would travel to Pluto aboard their Cybrid vessel and immediately drop themselves right on top of Prometheus's temple base. Eventually arriving in Pluto's orbit, the Cybrid defenses immediately opened fire on the captured ship. With their Trojan horse coming apart around them, Harabec ordered an immediate launch of their drop pods, which had already been loaded with the Cardinal Spear Hercs and tanks for the operation. However, without time to set proper landing coordinates, the members of Cardinal Spear were scattered all across Pluto's surface. Fortunately, after an indeterminate amount of time, Kanan had managed to rally with a squad of survivors, and together they made their way to Prometheus's temple. Harabec, unfortunately, landed several kilometers away from Kanan and his group. Communications would be re-established between the two brothers, and both agreed to reunite before moving into the final showdown with Prometheus. But while en route to meet his brother and the Cardinal Spear survivors, Harabec was ambushed by a staggering number of heavy assault warforms. In the resulting battle, the Phoenix gave it his all and managed to destroy many of the Cybrid marauders. But this time, unlike all the others, his luck had run out. After Prometheus was destroyed, Kanan returned to the resting site of his brother. While he was unable to remove his body from the wreckage, he instead opted to cut off his head and transport it back to Earth, to fulfill a sworn oath he made to Emperor Petrison before leaving for Operation Red Whirlwind. Of course, what Kanan didn't know was that by doing this, he had saved the immortal mind within. Harabec Weathers, the man, may have died, but the Phoenix, true to its namesake, would transcend its mortality. Over 1,000 years after the Starsiege, in the unforgiving depths of the Wilder Zone, the first settlers would follow Harabec's ideals of freedom, independence, and a dedication to being the fiercest warriors humanity had ever witnessed. In that same spirit, these intrepid men and women would call themselves the Children of the Phoenix. Indeed, the fires of Harabec's legacy would never be extinguished.